So now we're going to hear from Campbell Leckie, who's from Hawkesbury Regional Council and one of the key figures in Cape to City. Campbell.
Thanks, Roger. Excuse me. Can you hear me all right? Lovely. Look, the ambitious idea is step forward 15 years, and across New Zealand there's roughly 1.5 million hectares of really high quality predator control in 10 to 30,000 hectare blocks, a lot of it on farmland. And it's fundamentally changing the equation that Jan Wright was talking about yesterday for our bird populations and our threatened native species. We absolutely believe that's possible, but it's not necessarily easy to achieve, but it certainly is doable. I'd like to talk a little bit about this project, Cape to City. Collaboration is talked about an awful lot. This project is a real example of that across a range of partners, and I won't get into all the partners here. National Science Challenge has been key, as has Landcare Research. DOC's a key partner. But one of the really interesting things for me, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, is we've been very fortunate to build a partnership with the Aotearoa Foundation, which is a philanthropic trust. And I think they have a really critical role over the next 20 years in changing the game for biodiversity and conservation in New Zealand. So I'm going to start a little bit at the high level, and then I want to get down into the project detail a little bit more. So Cape to City's vision, if you like, is native species thrive where we live, work and play. And the fundamental bottom line on that is we believe that it's only when each individual understands how they can personally make a difference for biodiversity that you'll get the level of social momentum and change required to effectively reduce this or reverse this trend. So this graph is really simple. What it's saying is biodiversity is on a countdown and it's going in the wrong direction. And we have to turn that around. But it's only when you get enough critical momentum around people that's combined with good science and good operations at scale that we will change that arrow. One other comment I'd make is we are not going to change that with business as usual. That is absolutely the case, so we have to think a little differently. Now, you've got to be careful around these sorts of comments because biodiversity is an extremely complex topic, and we've seen a lot of that in the last sort of 36 hours in the first day of this conference. But I just want to simplify it down very briefly. For me, and for the project team involved in Cape to City, there are three key strategic levers. One is predator pest management. The second is habitat restoration to reconnect the environment for these native species who want to thrive. Without that, you can take all the predators away you like, but you won't get the full benefits. And the final bit is actually 50% of this picture is about people. It is people that will make the change and adopt the technology and undertake the operations to drive what's needed. And again, this is a bit of a high-level overview, but essentially we see some really key elements in this, and how we integrate this across the system is actually very important. Sanctuaries have a key role. They're the arcs at the moment in many cases for survival of these species while we sort out the bigger picture. They're a very important way of connecting people into biodiversity and conservation. And actually, much like the Cape Sanctuary, they're a hub for outflow or a halo effect over time as we succeed in the wider landscape. We actually have to really figure out how we change and get urban people involved in a whole lot greater way. And I just want to quickly make a comment here that I think our investment needs to skew a little. It's very easy to find money for predator operations or research, well, not very easy necessarily, but it's easier to find money for predator operations, research around ecological restoration. The social context, the social process to drive this change is a whole lot harder to fund, as is the education, which is extremely critical to the long view. The final point I want to make here is that from our perspective, when we talk about Cape to City, we're talking about farmland often. But we have to recognise that farmland connects across a system of urban areas, public conservation land, and sanctuaries. But to be really frank, farmland is roughly 2/3 of New Zealand's land area. If we don't have a solution for biodiversity that includes farmland, we actually, in our view, don't have a solution. That's why it's so important. Now, just moving towards close to the project context, so this is the Hawke's Bay region, and what you can see in a lot of this area here, this sort of mauvey pinky colour, that's our current possum control area program, where possum numbers are quite low, and if you include that with the TB-free, excellent work done by TB-free Osprey, roughly 90% of the rateable land in our region's got very low possum numbers. Now, the reality is we're probably significantly over-investing in possum control, and so what we were looking to do with this project is to shift from just that to those, but in a very, very low cost way. And we have to change this cost game, otherwise it's not sustainable long term for our community. But that's the strategic shift we're trying to make, if you like, in the template around Cape to City. Pest control, for most of you will know this, but pest control has two distinct phases. First phase is the initial knockdown of the pest, which can often be quite expensive. And then unless you're in an island eradication scenario, you're into long-term maintenance. So you're in it for good unless you manage to eradicate. Our perspective is that what we can do with a one-off transformational investment here is potentially set it up very long-term for a sustainable low cost in terms of predator control until eradication is possible. The problem we've got is right at the moment, the maintenance cost per year, at least for farmland, is much higher than our community can sustain long term. That's part of what Cape to City is looking at to try and change. We have to get that long-term cost low enough so that we can operate at really large scale in a sustainable way with our community. I won't get into, there's a lot of stuff happening in Cape to City. In particular, wireless technology for traps will change the game. There is no doubt about that. It'll reduce probably 50 to 60% of the labour cost, and that's fundamental. In terms of Cape to City itself, I'd just like to now talk very briefly and give you a quick Google flyover of it. So the project's 26,000 hectares. Now that's good, but if that's all it was, it wouldn't be particularly transformational. But the project is quite reflective of a lot of our Hawke's Bay country. So we're trying to develop a template which is available for use across the rest of our region, and others could potentially apply it elsewhere as well. But this is the Cape to City project. You can see now those little green areas on there, that's the simulated trap lines that we saw earlier in Fiona Carswell's presentation. Coming back to this, the social context of this is very important. You can see as you're flying around, you've got Havelock North, also unfortunately mentioned today. We've also got these other small communities in and around the project area. The social context of this is critical. 50% of this picture and success is about people, and how we integrate those into the long-term sustainable solution for predator pest control is really important. You can see here as well, as we're flying down, we're flying towards this, the Cape Sanctuary area. Very fortunate there, lots of native birds, lots of, and it's a working farm. You know, there's Pātiki there on duck ponds. So ultimately, it's a very good example of what you can achieve in the right context for biodiversity in farmland. That's the predator fence we're flying down now. Andy's point was, actually, if we're successful long term, we shouldn't need that in the future. Now, the project's got 5 or 6 work streams in it. It's a lot of research happening on this project. And if you'd like to look at that research, it's all up on our website, Cape to City website, which I'll show you right at the end of the presentation. We're trying to make that stuff as available as possible. We've been really fortunate to be Landcare Research in particular and the National Science Challenge have been great partners. Now, the reason I say that is they have involved us as end users in driving the research questions, which has been fundamental to shaping management and insight into what we do. As you head up, you can see these pest areas, the pest control. What we need to do in terms of low cost is actually find a way to probably strip out 60 to 70% of the current cost of farmland predator maintenance, which again, it means it's not an incremental change, it's a fundamental transformational shift. All sorts of work being done now is really useful to this project. Heidi Kakallis' work around cats is very important in the context of this. how far out do your buffer zones go from these little communities? Because you're killing feral cats in this project. It is on the target species list. And just for your interest, in our initial control to date, we're probably catching 4 to 6 feral cats per mustelid across the area. So they're a significant predator pest in this farmland context. These areas here, you can see just flying over now, are native bush areas, quite significant chunks of native bush. The vision of this project is not about killing pests. It's actually about native species recovering, thriving back in our landscape. Those areas of native bush, if they're conservation estate or farmland, are critical to that. And actually, if you look at New Zealand's land and water debate, there's a lot of planting going to go on in New Zealand in the next 10 or 20 years. That's going to start to reconnect our farmland landscape, which will be really valuable in this context. Other work streams in the project, there's a significant education work stream, very important social context, habitat restoration, project management. There's lots of stuff going on, and we're very fortunate to have a really good project team and a governance group. So that in essence is a really quick overview of the project, but what I'd like to try and build a picture on now is the regional predator control rollout. So what we're looking at is probably within 2 years, we believe, we will have enough confidence to actually be going out to areas within our community, choosing 30,000 hectares or 20,000 hectares, and starting to build towards these areas where there's very high quality predator control, but integrated across the region in a strategic way to drive biodiversity and conservation benefits. The habitat restoration context is, as I've said, absolutely important. And ultimately, from our point of view, how we do that, we actually need to get to a much more planned way of doing habitat restoration. So there's not a lot of habitat left in some of this farmland. We actually need to say, here's the current state, here is our understanding of the biology of the native species we want to recover and thrive, here's where we need to go and plant to actually get the reconnected landscape, because we haven't got the money to actually plant everywhere straight away. So it needs to be done much more smartly. And finally, just coming back to the comment around business and biodiversity, this, for me, we need to understand where and why business invest, and we actually need to show them where they can invest with impact and what their goals are. From my point of view, I think this is a really important one, and we really are only just starting that. There are some really good examples of it, but collectively as a nation, in 15 or 20 years' time, we need to have really articulated well how and where business should invest. So finally, we need to change how we think about ecological restoration. Business as usual will not get us to where we need to be, and ultimately, we have a very clear view and vision around the role of farmland in recovering biodiversity in New Zealand. It's absolutely critical from our perspective, and if we don't have it as part of the solution, we don't have a solution. And also, look, we've had a lot of requests over the last 2 or 3 years from people to come and visit the project. Some of those we've been able to fulfill, some we haven't, and we're holding to help transfer as much as we know and have learnt. And quite frankly, we're not getting it all right either. There are, the odd times we make mistakes, but hopefully we can all learn from that. So November the 14th to the 16th, there's a national conference in Napier around Cape to City, what we're doing, transferring that knowledge so that hopefully we can build the system to learn a little faster. Anyway, hey, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. When you engage with large-scale landowners, do you find there are common sets of objections that you encounter, or what's the general reaction?
My apologies, I didn't actually get that question properly. Can you repeat that?
Yeah, sure. When you engage with large-scale landowners, do you find that there is a common theme, a common set of objections that come out, or are they, how well do they engage?
Yeah, look, so our experience has been that you could broadly characterise it this way. 20% of farmers in New Zealand understand that being good in the environment is good for their business. It's a fundamental thing. Probably 50% have a strong economic driver around business success, and they like the idea, but they want to understand how to connect business success to it, and they haven't quite got that necessarily yet, and we need to help in articulating that. Big landowners, our experience is, because they're critical to this process, they do have a common theme of things. Often it is around what's the total cost, what's the benefits around this to my farm business, how much impact is it on my farm business around management long term and things like that. But just quickly, we did a survey in 2006 around a number of Hawke's Bay farmers in our possum control program then. Most of these are sheep and beef farmers, so that's the standard for a lot of the land use in Hawke's Bay. And 35% of them valued the biodiversity benefits, which they could attribute from being involved in these sorts of programs. So a large number of them also value that side of the context as well. Thanks, Sue.